The Nuremberg trials were not the only place where he had made this statement. And in the previous installment of this series of shows about Antarctica, I mentioned that the first territorial incursion committed by the Nazi Party in 1939 was not really their invasion of Poland, which would happen later in the year in September of 1939, but rather their takeover of Norwegian sovereign territory at the northern tip of Antarctica. This happened in January of 1939. But why? What were the Nazis looking for? As this saga continues to unfold, I am gradually becoming more convinced that the early Nazi success in Antarctica provided the impetus for everything else that was to come in September of that same year. What I'm saying is that without the Deutsche Antarctica success in 1939, World War II might never have happened. But first, we must look at the temporal context of that decade. What else was going on around these events? On the one hand, we have a humiliated Germany struggling to cope with the aftermath of the First World War. Then, on the other hand, we have the rise of the anti-humanist movements as popularized by men like Friedrich Nietzsche and Karl Marx. The Industrial Revolution was in supercharged mode, and the Hegelian dialectic was on schedule to produce the future child of this marriage between Renaissance humanism and the anti-humanism of the 20th century. That entity we now see rising before us in the 21st century, the coming of transhumanist robots, mechanical human hybrids, and artificial intelligence. Now, on top of all of that, the Babylonian priesthood threw even more gasoline on the flames near the dawn of the 20th century by spreading the idea that a utopian city powered by some uber energy force named Vril and inhabited by a race of superhumans sat at the center of planet Earth. Add a pinch of spice in 1929 when that prehistorical Antarctica Piri Reis map was serendipitously rediscovered, and the stage was set for the astounding events that were to happen throughout World War II. Now, we're going to go back a little further, back to the beginning of the 19th century, as far back as 1818. And this would be even a few decades before the birth of Adolf Hitler. And in 1818, a theory was already spreading that the Earth was a hollow shell. This has come to be known as the hollow Earth theory. They believed that there were openings several thousand kilometers wide at both the North and South poles. Even astronomer Edward Halley of Halley's Comet fame proposed this idea as a scientific theory. However, he was not the first to imagine such a thing. A quick perusal of the Wikipedia article about the hollow Earth theory reveals that all over the world and all through history, mankind has held a belief that some kind of paradise civilization existed before a global flood, and that it managed to survive that deluge by submerging itself underground. And if history and anthropology have taught us anything, it's that you should never discount a widespread ancient legend too quickly before you really investigate it. And now, fast forward a little bit to the year 1871. We're in the middle of the reign of Queen Victoria, and there is an author by the name of Edward Bulwer Lytton who wrote several science fiction tales and poems and books. And he's famous for writing a book entitled The Vril, The Power of the Coming Race. Now, note that this novel was written as a fictional tale. In his book, the hero falls through a subterranean cavern and then discovers a lost civilization of superhuman survivors of an ancient global deluge. Vril was their civilization's power source, something like a philosopher's stone or the Force that is popularized in the Star Wars movies. This Force had the power of creation and destruction, which is a recurring theme that keeps finding its expression from the legends of the ancient goddess Vishnu up to our day with the Large Hadron Collider at CERN. And if this idea of a story of a paradise civilization that is found amidst the secret mountains of some ice-covered territory, that might remind you of a movie back in 1973 called Lost Horizon. I remember watching this as a teenager, and I remember being just captivated by the idea that some sort of perfect paradise was located where people could go and always live a young life and have basically immortality handed to them. The story was a popular one, and it continues to be down to this day. Now, even though that story was meant to be enjoyed as a fiction, that era's darlings du jour of the global priesthood picked up on it right away to use for their own ends. They began to suggest that Vril was a very real magical force. It was yours for the taking, but you'll have to make contact with the ascended masters and really get back to your human roots. Occultists like Aleister Crowley and Madame Helen Blavatsky were leaders in promoting the idea of its existence within their circles of sophisticated intellectuals, financial tycoons, and forward thinkers of Europe and America. Now, the short story here is that an idea was being planted that the northern ancestors of the German people had access to the center of the earth and indeed could travel all over the earth, even to the opposite pole, via subterranean passages. The shamans of Tibet supposedly knew all about this, and they could provide the instruction for how to obtain this magical Vril power. He who had the Vril would be unconquerable. Go find Shambhala or Agartha or Shangri-La or whatever you want to call it, and you can rule the world as a superhuman ultra-terrestrial. Therefore, when the Germans faced defeat after the First World War, the soil was fertile for the rise of the esoteric beliefs of the Thule Society and eventually of those doctrines pursued by the secretive Ahnenerbe of the Nazi Party. The deflated Teutons desperately needed to find something to overcome the tyranny of what they perceived as their British-Israeli overlords, who now monopolized the oil industry. Vril sounded like they needed. So, in 1938, the Germans began planning an expedition to Antarctica, and they invited famous American polar explorer Admiral Richard Byrd, or in the future he would have the title Admiral. This time he was Richard Byrd, to lecture them about what to expect down at the southern continent. And remember, this is pre-war Germany, so ostensibly there would be no reason for the future admiral to expect anything other than scientific motivation on the part of the Germans, or so we are led to believe. Now, according to a Wikipedia article about this 1938 expedition by the Germans down to Antarctica, the public is told that the Reich's interest in Antarctica was simply to exploit her vast whaling resources. But when you read the article, I'll let you decide if this sounds like the preparations of a harmless whaling camp. The page says, on the 19th of January, 1939, the ship arrived at the Princess Martha Coast in an area which had lately been claimed by Norway as Queen Maud Land, and they began charting the region. Nazi German flags were placed on the sea ice along the coast. naming the area New Schwabenland after the ship. The expedition established a temporary base, and in the following weeks, teams walked along the coast recording claim reservations on hills and other significant landmarks. And then the article goes on to show that they took more than 16,000 aerial photographs. They flew all over the place, and they were definitely pursuing a reconnaissance mission over the entire area. And they were literally dropping little swastika flags all over the continent to mark their territory. And that's the end of that Wikipedia article, or that citation. Anyway, 8 months later, the world was at war by the time September of 1939 rolled around. Well, not quite the whole world. It was the world minus the United States. While the world was beginning to shake bloody hands with Hitler, President Roosevelt, along with the State Department and the U.S. Treasury, sent Rear Admiral Byrd on his own expedition to Antarctica. Now, for such a seemingly unimportant, useless continent, there sure seemed to be a lot of sudden interest down at the South Pole. Now, another Wikipedia page explains a little bit more about what Franklin Roosevelt's intentions were in 1939. And by the way, this is not the expedition that Admiral Byrd would later become even more famous for after the war. That one was called Operation High Jump. This was an expedition that President Roosevelt was pursuing just as the rest of the world was embroiled in World War II. And this Wikipedia page goes on to say, the objectives of the expedition were outlined in an order from President Franklin D. Roosevelt dated November 25th, 1939. The President wanted 2 bases to be established, East Base in the vicinity of Sharkha Island or Alexander I Land, or on Marguerite Bay, if no accessible site could be found on either of the other specified islands. The base that America came to set up came to be known as Little America. And the article goes on to describe what the GPS coordinates of it would be. And then the citation finishes, in view of the broad scope of the objectives and the unpredictable circumstances that always arise in Antarctica, it is remarkable that most of the objectives set for them were met. And that's the end of that citation. And in March of 1941, this American expedition was concluded. The ships turned home, and from that point forward, the United States threw itself into its own preparations to enter the bloody theater of World War II. Now, so those are all the events swirling around the world. Meanwhile, in the middle of all of this, a top-ranking Nazi party member decided to make a trip to Scotland. Now, we're going to take a break here, and when we return, we'll talk about the capture of Rudolf Hess by British authorities in May of 1941, and what did he know or possibly pass to the United Kingdom. A famous Nazi insider, Rudolf Hess, was making his own little flight, attempting to make contact with British authorities. And there has always been debate over whether or not the occult beliefs of the Thule Society, of which he was a member, really held any power over Hitler, or whether all of that was superseded by the famous Ahnenerbe group that Himmler established. And if you ever watched any documentaries on the History Channel, you've noticed that they have often portrayed shows that discuss the occult beliefs of the Nazi Party and how they were running all around the planet looking for objects that by which they could obtain some sort of supernatural power to give them world-dominating energy. Now, one thing we do know for sure is that Rudolf Hess was an original member of the Thule Society as well as a prominent Nazi insider. And in May of 1941, only 2 years after the German expedition to Antarctica and only 2 months after the American one, Rudolf Hess flew into Scotland and asked to meet with the Duke of Hamilton. This has always been one of the greatest British mysteries of the war. In theory, Hess offered a truce deal, but was rejected. Millions of lives could have been spared if the Anglo powers had accepted his offer, or that's the way the public has been told the story. However, another angle in all of this is that Rudolf Hess was a man with ties to many secret societies, and he had knowledge of the German Deutsche interest in the South Pole. Remember, Admiral Byrd was a Washington, D.C. Freemason, and of course, the ruling class in England was under the thumb of the City of London bankers and really the descendants of the Knights Templar financial network. It was Rudolf Hess's Thule Society that sponsored the German Antarctic expedition of 1938. Now, I have a quotation here from the October 2005 issue of Nexus magazine about what may have been going on with Rudolf Hess in his decision to fly into Scotland. It says, it reminds us he asked to meet with the Duke of Hamilton. His plans for peace talks were quickly rebutted, and so began his 46-year incarceration. Hess's imprisonment is one of the most widely discussed mysteries of the war. As Christoph Friedrich claims, some believe that Hess was entrusted with the all-important Antarctic file. But whether this was a paper file or a mental note, one thing is for certain. Hess, Deputy Fuhrer, would have known everything about the Nazis' Antarctic intentions. Rudolf Hess was also an active member of the Thule Society, and his interest in Antarctica would have been on both personal and professional levels. Now note this, Hess, a keen aviator, used his position in both the Nazi Party and the Thule Society to meet Richard Byrd when he lectured the personnel who were heading for the Antarctic with the Deutsche Antarctic Expedition in 1938. And through his channels, Hess would have known everything that had been discovered in New Schwabenland. Now, Richard Byrd, a living legend throughout the world for being the first man to fly over both North and South Poles, was possibly the most well-informed polar explorer ever, and he divulged his vast knowledge and details of his exploits to the Nazis. Byrd's advice in his lecture and ultimately the Nazis' successful expedition to claim New Schwabenland may have given the Nazis conviction enough to establish a viable Antarctic base. Hess's flight and eventual capture a few years after the Deutsche Antarctica expedition meant that plans would have been underway. And that's the end of the quote from the Nexus magazine. So that's 1941. Now, 4 years later, Adolf Hitler would be supposedly dead by suicide or possibly transported in the spring of 1945 to the Southern Hemisphere, whether Chile, Argentina, or possibly even this base in Antarctica. Meanwhile, Rudolf Hess, who had been arrested immediately in Scotland in 1941, never saw freedom again. In 1946, he joined his colleagues on trial at Nuremberg. He was convicted and then sent to Spandau prison. Overall, he spent 46 years under custody and ended his life by suicide at Spandau. Repeated efforts by family members to get him released near the end of his life were constantly blocked by Russian authorities. Now, in contrast to this 46-year term that Hess managed to serve under incarceration, another German Antarctic Nazi insider got off with only a 10-year sentence. And that's the man we mentioned at the beginning of the show, the man that Hitler assigned to be his successor as president of Germany, the man who was in charge of the German Kriegsmarine. Basically, that he was the Secretary of the Navy, and he was really the man who is famous for building up the extreme functionality of the German U-boats. Now, here's another extract from this Nexus magazine that sums up the outcome of Rudolf Hess's role in this whole tale. The secrets he gave away in those 4 years, though dismissed officially as lunacy by the British government and at the Nuremberg trials, were taken seriously in some quarters, particularly after Britain had caught more of Germany's most powerful Nazis at the end of the war. Unfortunately, with Hess being imprisoned until his suspicious suicide in 1987, at the age of 97, all records about him are locked firmly away under the UK Official Secrets Act and will be for the foreseeable future. Only circumstantial evidence can be used to gauge how much or how little Hess knew about the Antarctic haven. Meanwhile, Admiral Karl Donitz was convicted at Nuremberg, but he only served a light sentence of 10 years. He finished his life in Hamburg, Germany, writing memoirs and giving interviews. He was extremely vocal about his pro-Nazi views the whole time. He died of a heart attack on Christmas Eve of 1980, and his funeral was held on January 5, 1981. His funeral was attended by thousands of his comrades, and among those attending were 100 Knight's Cross holders. Now, it's interesting that at this time, the German government forbade them from wearing their uniforms because the members of the German government felt that Admiral Donitz had been too deeply involved with the activities of the Third Reich. And yet what a contrast. Everyone knew what a powerful person he had been in serving the Third Reich, and yet his sentence was only 10 years. Now, in our next future show of the Being Eden, we're going to talk about the events that transpired that swirl around Admiral Donitz and just exactly what were the British expeditions doing down in Antarctica and the shocking discoveries that they made that involved physical evidence about a Nazi polar base, the continent of Antarctica. The subject for today's show is Operation Tabarin and what the Brits found. Now, in the previous episode of this Antarctica series, we talked about the propaganda that was carefully planted at the beginning of the 20th century by an elite circle of occultists, intelligence operatives, and fictional writers who held memberships in secret societies. The message that they were seeding in the public's mind was the idea that there is a location somewhere on Earth where the remains of a prehistoric civilization can be found, a place where people had mastered the use of an all-powerful energy force called the Vril, and that word is spelled V like Victor, R-I-L. It was conjectured that the Earth was really a hollow sphere and that it was possible to travel to any point on Earth's surface via subterranean passages and tunnels. Supposedly, these people had achieved a paradise-like civilization that they enjoyed with incredibly long lifespans. Now, all of that might sound familiar to you as a plot from an old movie called Lost Horizon, and indeed that fictional book did emerge out of this general stream of thought. We'll take a quick break here, but come right back because we're going to dive into a fantastic, unbelievable story of what happened next, a story that indicates that the British Empire believed the words of Admiral Dönitz of the German Navy, and that they sent special intelligence teams down to Antarctica to see just what were the Germans up to on our most southern continent. This mythology proved to be especially tantalizing to a minority of German people who were desperately seeking a way to rebuild an empire left in ruins after World War I. This seemed to be the key that they were looking for. Just go find this secret place and rediscover our Aryan Nordic roots. Master this uber energy force called the Vril, and the world will be ours for the taking. Thus was born the Nazi Party and its embedded secret elite cults of SS officers and an even more secret and mysterious cult within that cult called the Ahnenerbe. These men truly believed that they could forge a new scientific technology by studying the ancient lost wisdom of prehistory. And to some extent, they did succeed in their quest. To this day, the extent of their achievements has been carefully concealed by the Allied powers, who supposedly won the Second World War. The man who took Hitler's place, the man who controlled Germany's navy and her mighty U-boat force, Admiral Karl Dönitz, stood up at the Nuremberg trials and unabashedly proclaimed that the Nazi Party had indeed built an impregnable paradise fortress for the Fuhrer. Does that sound too incredible to be true? Well, Karl Dönitz has gone down in history as the commander of the awe-inspiring German U-boat machine. He was fiercely loyal to the Nazi Party and continued to recognize Hitler as his Fuhrer long after Hitler's supposed death. He had good reason to believe that Hitler was still his Fuhrer, because the evidence is piling up that the Nazi Party simply transferred their headquarters from the northern hemisphere to the southern one in 1945, all with the aid of hundreds of U-boats that just seemed to never quite get accounted for by the Allies after World War II. Now, once again, we turn to the web extract entitled Britain's Secret War in Antarctica. And for those who are listening to this while viewing my blog, you'll see links to all these references that we mention in the show. But in this webpage, Britain's Secret War in Antarctica, there is a truly jaw-dropping narrative. It astounds me that nobody has produced a blockbuster movie or a 7-part Netflix miniseries of this supposedly non-fictional tale. Well, maybe that's not so surprising. Sometimes it suits the interests of the intelligence agencies to divert the public's attention from the truth by spreading a buffet of UFOs, extraterrestrials, and official so-called World War II history documentaries. Even now, we see so much being produced that comes close to, and yet never quite landing directly on, the truth. Today's sequel in our Antarctica saga swirls around the role that Great Britain played in the secret Antarctica battlefront. Admiral Karl Dönitz of the German Navy held all the trump cards with his control of the German Kriegsmarine. As reported in that web extract, this is what they say, and I quote, "In one of his inaugural speeches to a select officer elite, Dönitz claimed that the German submarine fleet is proud of having built for the Fuhrer in another part of the world a Shangri-La land, an impregnable fortress." That's the end of the quote. Now, this was an impressive statement, and one that inspired allegiance in his officers and pride in Hitler and the Kriegsmarine, the German Navy. Dunet's statement spread around the Kriegsmarine with gusto, for all who heard it believed in the possibility. At the conclusion of my previous story, I raised an eyebrow over the fact that Dunet received a mere 10-year slap on the wrist as his punishment for Nazi crimes against humanity following his trial at Nuremberg. What's more, when released from Spandau prison, he got to live out his days in free West Germany in Hamburg. There were other Nazi officials with far less devoted allegiance who received sterner sentences and were dragged off to East Germany. Therefore, it is the speculation of that same web article I quoted from earlier that Dunetz likely struck a deal with the Allies. The web article goes on to say this, and I quote, "In light of Dunetz's pledge to continue the fight and the vast force still under his command, and considering Allied fears, could peace have been struck, a peace that had guarantees for all sides, Dunetz could have asked for Germany to be rebuilt and not humiliated like at Versailles at the end of the First World War. For the Western Allies to fight the spread of Bolshevism and for leniency, if not clemency, from the victors, including a whitewash of his personal wartime history, in exchange for a total surrender and for passing on extremely sensitive intelligence. Only a week after Dunetz had declared that the war would continue whilst Bolshevism persisted, he ordered the surrender of all German forces. All the facts indicate that Dunetz's history has been suppressed, and against all reason, Dunetz is still not perceived by mainstream historians as having been a major player in Nazi Germany. Clemency was shown with such a short prison sentence, the communist threat had been realized by the Western Allies, and West Germany rose out of the ashes of May 1945 to become the powerhouse of Europe, with many of the major companies that bankrolled the Nazi Party forming huge conglomerates. And that's the end of the quote from that article. So what we're saying here is that to strike such a sweetheart deal with the Allies, the victors of World War II must have had reason to believe that his Shangri-La in the Southern Hemisphere was no mere rant of an insane naval admiral. Indeed, there is a first-person account that proves that Great Britain had discovered at least one Nazi Shangri-La in Antarctica during this operation called Operation Tamarin. What's more, Britain held their intel tightly close to their vest and away from her closest ally, the United States. Now, we're going to get into the incredible tale that is told by a man who claims to be a survivor of a military operation that was sent down to the United Kingdom. And his story has never been thoroughly debunked. It was downplayed, which was interesting. The government downplayed his story, which tended to lend some bit of credibility to his story. But the story has never been completely either corroborated nor debunked. Now, here is where the story takes place between October to December of the year 1945. And I continue from my blog. Decades after the war, a survivor of a British special ops team told the tale of a top-secret assignment that landed him and a dozen or so commandos in a campaign for which he would never receive any public credit. It is whispered as Britain's New Schwabenland campaign. New Schwabenland was the name that Germany gave to the piece of Antarctica that they claimed for themselves. And this was located, if you look at a map of Antarctica, this is in the territory named Queen Maud Land. and it's the land that Hitler's people had basically walked all over because it literally belonged to Norway. But even before Hitler invaded Poland, he went down there with his forces and staked a claim down on Norway's territory. In my previous story, I mentioned that as the actual first invasion that took place by the Germans, even before their invasion of Poland. Okay, now this story takes place in the months October to December of 1945, and remember, in the southern hemisphere, that would be the warmer months. Now, keep in mind that this time period of October of 1945, it's so critical when you overlay all the other events taking place in other parts of the world. Hitler's crowd has made their getaway to Argentina in the months of April and May of 1945. Admiral Karl Dönitz gets arrested on May of 23rd, 1945. Germany surrenders, and the Nuremberg trial dates are set. At almost the exact same moment, when Europe is celebrating VE Day in May of 1945, way down in Swabia, Antarctica, there are two panicked survivors of a previous British reconnaissance team who are screaming these terrifying words into a radio message. "The polar men have found us." And then, boom, their radio goes dead. Now, this special ops veteran relates his story, and I have this all linked in my blog if you want to check out the source of this story. He says, "We were told in no specific terms what was expected of us and what Britain expected us to find on Antarctica. Britain had more than a strong suspicion that the Germans had built a secret base and had spirited many of the unaccounted Nazis away from the turmoil in Europe. Still, more and more revelations were forthcoming. The summer before, we were told, the original scientists and commandos had found an ancient tunnel. Under orders, the force went through the tunnel, but only 2 returned before the Antarctic winter set in. That would have been during our summer months." Okay, then he goes on. "During the winter months down there, the 2 survivors made absurd claims over the radio about polar men, ancient tunnels, and Nazis. Radio contact was finally lost in July of 1945 with these 2 men. And ominously for our mission, going into the unknown, the last broadcast us all further anxiety as we listened to the fear in the voice. The polar men have found us," was screamed before contact was lost. After the radio broadcast was played, we were then given a rousing speech from the major who would be leading the expedition to investigate what had happened. "We are to go to the base at Maldheim, find the tunnel, investigate the enigma of the polar men and the Nazis, and do what we can to make sure the Nazi threat is destroyed." Now, this veteran goes on to describe how his commando team found one of those 2 British spies manning the now deserted camp in October of 1945. This one lone survivor had been alone all there since July of 1945. So this freshly arrived team of commandos wanted to know what happened to his comrade. Apparently, the 2 of them were part of a larger team of spies who discovered a long tunnel located in a dry valley that opened eventually into a huge cavern staffed by hundreds of Nazi personnel. The story goes on, and I quote, "The vast underground cavern was abnormally warm. Some of the scientists believed that it was warmed geothermally. In the huge cavern were underground lakes. However, the mystery deepened as the cavern was lit artificially. The cavern proved so extensive that they had to split up, and that was when the real discoveries were made. The Nazis had constructed a huge base into the caverns and had even built docks for U-boats, and one was identified supposedly. Still, the deeper they traveled, the more strange visions they were greeted with. Quite a few years ago, and this man purports to be one of the survivors of a reconnaissance team, or actually a search and rescue team that was sent down to Antarctica in October of 1945 to go investigate and rescue some survivors of a previous reconnaissance mission. Great Britain had actually sent quite a few expeditions down to Antarctica during the war years. So that part is known for sure. It's this part of the story that has never been officially acknowledged by the government. In fact, all the files regarding these Antarctica expeditions by Great Britain in the 40s remain classified to this day. But let's pick up where we left off. And according to the story, he had said that the Nazis had constructed a huge base into the ice caverns and had even built docks that could accommodate U-boats. And as this team continued advancing forward secretly through the cavern, they found more and more strange sights. Now, this survivor reported that hangars for strange planes and excavations galore had been documented. However, their presence had not gone unnoticed. This team of British search and rescue commandos were trying to make their way and investigate this Nazi base, but unfortunately, their presence did get noticed. The two survivors at the Mannheim base witnessed their comrades get captured and executed one by one. And I apologize, this part of the story is actually talking about the original reconnaissance team back in June of 1945, who had first uncovered the Nazi base. After witnessing only 6 of the executions, they fled to the tunnel lest they be caught, with the aim to block up the tunnel. Though it was too late, the polar men were coming, claimed the survivor. So what happened, this team had got discovered, and they wanted to block the tunnel to this Nazi base, but only 2 of these British men were able to get out alive, and they had some creature called a polar man who was chasing them. And the story goes on. With enemy forces hot on their tail, they had no choice but to try to get back to the base so that they could inform and warn their superiors about what they had uncovered. They managed to get back to their base, but with winter approaching and little chance of rescue, they believed it was their duty to make sure that the secret Nazi base was reported. And so they split up, each taking a wireless radio and waiting in separate bunkers. One of the survivors tempted one of the polar men into the bunker in the hope that they'd believe only one had survived. Now, there's no picture, of course, of what these polar men look like, but in your mind, if you can envision something like a Bigfoot or a Sasquatch, that might be something akin to what this reporter was describing. So there's a polar man or a pair of them who are chasing these 2 British spies. They split up so that they have a better chance of having one of them achieving safety in the bunker. They each had a wireless radio. The plan worked, but to the detriment of his life, of one of these 2 British commandos, and to the radio. Unfortunately, the brave soul in Bunker 1 had the only fully operational wireless radio, which was destroyed in the fracas. The other survivor had no option but to sit and try to avoid going stir-crazy. So what he's saying is these 2 people were being chased. by this polar man. They each had a radio, and unfortunately, the man who had the better radio got captured by the polar man. Now, this lone survivor goes on to say the mystery of who or what the polar men were was explained, not satisfactorily, but explained nonetheless as a product of Nazi science. And the enigma of how the Nazis were getting power was also explained, albeit not in scientific terms. The power that the Nazis were utilizing was by volcanic activity, which gave them heat for steam and also helped produce electricity. But the Nazis had also mastered an unknown energy source because the survivor claimed, and we quote, "After what I witnessed, the amount of electricity needed is more than could have been produced, in my opinion, by steam." Now, after hearing this lone survivor story, the major of the commando team here in October of 1945 decided that they should go investigate whatever was locked up behind the door of Bunker 1. That's where the other commando team member with the better radio had got stuck in there and got chased in there by a polar man. The lone survivor begged them not to open that bunker, but they did it anyway. The veteran eyewitness reported that indeed a huge, hairy polar man ran out so fast that the team only got off a few shots. The humanoid escaped into the wilderness, and the team discovered the bones of the other survivor of the spy team, the one who had the better radio. He had been devoured by the polar man, who sat in that bunker for nearly 4 months, between July to October of 45, waiting for a rescue team. We'll take a little pause here, and I encourage you to look this up on the blog and click the links that I provide to finish reading this riveting tale. The conclusion of this account states that the commando team did in fact investigate the tunnel and did discover a highly populated Nazi base, just as this lone spy survivor had reported. The commando team lured the polar man to his death and laid mines all over the tunnel and partially into the cavern's space. However, just when the commando team was preparing to detonate the explosives, they were discovered by the Nazi guards. A chase was given, and this one veteran of the team who's giving this story to this newspaper reporter, him plus a Norwegian guide and a scientist observer were all that got away safely from this chase. Even the lone survivor of the original reconnaissance team was killed in this mission. These 3 men lived to tell the tale only to themselves and a handful of British elite. The rest of the commando team accomplished their mission goal to wipe out any evidence of the tunnel by detonating the explosive, but they paid for their bravery with their lives and remain unsung heroes of this Antarctic battleground. Now, keep in mind that all of this is happening just as the Nuremberg trials are opening over in Europe. Admiral Karl Dönitz makes his public statements about some paradise fortress staffed for the Fuhrer. The British are happy that they succeeded in blocking any evidence of this one tunnel, but how do they know if there might be other similar caverns and Nazi bases in Antarctica? Well, they only have to wait a few more months to find out, and that will be the subject of a future episode in this Antarctic tale. It's the very highly publicly American expedition known as Operation High Jump. Now, in conclusion, I'd like to mention something that Dr. Joseph P. Farrell mentioned recently about these events in Antarctica. And in a recent radio interview that he gave really just a few weeks ago, he made this point. It's safe to assume that the Nazis looked at that story of Atlantis from that ancient story by Plato in the same way. And the reason I say this is that in 1935, Heinrich Himmler began to recruit people into the SS that had, let's say, esoteric credentials. In 1940, he officially establishes the Ahnenerbe, or that translates as the Ancestral Research Bureau. In the memo he uses to establish this thing, this department is set up to investigate occult lore, legends, literature, practices of all types, no matter how loony it seemed, for its potential military application. So in other words, Dr. Farrell says, what Nazi Germany is telling you is that it's the first modern great power that is deliberately going out and looking for a lot of ancient stuff for its potential military application. And this was the quote that I love from Dr. Farrell. He says, we now have the weaponization of archaeology. To me, this is a clear signal that the Nazis suspect there's something going on in these ancient texts that clearly indicate that there is a destructive technology that simply went missing when we blew ourselves apart in some earlier part of human history. I think, given all these background circumstances, it's a plausible speculation that, yes, they were going down to Antarctica to look for something. So put that into the context of the recent visit by Secretary of State John Kerry and all kinds of other high-profile visitors, which include Prince Harry, King Juan Carlos, and even the Patriarch of the Russian Orthodox Church. And that's where we'll leave the story today. And when we get together again at the Bee in Eden, we're going to pick up with the disastrous 1946 American invasion in Antarctica that is now known as Operation High Jump. But for now, this is the host of your show, Sedona Deb, buzzing back to her blog and wishing you pleasant thoughts as you ponder all these stories that may or may not be true, that have a bearing on us knowing exactly what has happened in mankind's past and how it is affecting mankind's future.